Welcome back to Debrief. Many of us know Iran only as a nation under strict theocracy, the supreme leader calling all the shots, a nation high up on the U.S. list of state sponsors of terror, a regime calling for the destruction of Israel, and lately the subject of a lot of threats from President Donald Trump. But others might remember a completely different reality, Iran under the Shah, before the 1979 revolution, an Iran close to the U.S. and the Persian Gulf states, and with working ties with Israel. Reza Pahlavi is the eldest son of Iran's late Shah. He's been living in exile since the revolution and is joining us now from our studios in Washington. Mr. Pahlavi, thanks very much for being with us.
Hello, Nurit. Good to be with you.
So I want to start off asking you about President Trump, who just left the Middle East, his tour obviously in Riyadh, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem. If it wasn't clear before, President Trump drew a very clear line in the sand, an alliance with the Sunni Arab states and against Iran. What is your take on this new American policy?
Well, I think that if you compare to his predecessors, be it the Democrats or the Republicans, who pretty much were either flirting with the regime or trying to contain it, we see a departure from that position. The way I interpret it is that this president seemed to understand that there has to be a solution beyond remaining strictly focused on the regime itself, that it is time to talk about the people as the element of change and therefore adopt the policy to what can be done to bring about a fundamental change. It won't happen at the hand of the regime, therefore it has to happen at the hand of the people. And I hope that the discourse of not just the United States of America, but the countries in the region and the rest will be this understanding that the Iranian people are the factor for change, and it's about time we focus on them rather than the regime.
Can this new policy, though, set the United States on a greater collision course with Iran, or you think perhaps the opposite?
Well, the collision course, as you put it, is with a regime that doesn't seem to want to abandon its behavior. And I think it's about time, in order to avoid, in fact, any kind of confrontation, to facilitate a change in a non-violent way by helping the Iranian people overcome this regime by means of civil disobedience, coupled with smart targeted sanctions that will further cripple the regime and force it to retreat and ultimately collapse. All of this within a controlled implosion and a transition that will lead to, hopefully, a democratic outcome.
So specifically, when you mentioned civil disobedience, and you mentioned that the regime that changes, of course, not going to come from this regime, what, first of all, would your message be to President Trump, how to step forward in bringing about that shift you described inside Iran?
You have to understand the dynamics of change in Iran within the scenario that I proposed. The most important component of this change would be the tacit cooperation of the existing military and paramilitary forces in this scenario of change. At the current time, they are in sort of no man's land. When we compare the situation that what happened in 2009 when the Green Movement was not supported, today the Iranian people who have it up to here with this regime demand some kind of intervention from the international community rushing to their support. Why is that component important? Because as you can realize, it is very difficult to overcome extremely repressive regimes by simply relying on peaceful disobedience. It has to be at some point an element of protection for the people. Now, this element of protection can only come from the military and paramilitary forces. I'm not saying that all of them will come in, but a great majority of them will join with the people if they know that they can survive beyond this regime in the future. They'll have a place in the future. They can rejoin the people and, in fact, become their protective shield should the remainder of the regime try to pursue a policy of genocide like Bashar Assad did against his own citizenry, and at the same time not be in no man's land. We know what we have to do as Iranians, and we won't want to depend on anybody else. All I'm trying to tell you is that our job will become much easier and much less blood will be shed if we have the tacit support of the international community with a policy not of behavior change of the regime, but of a regime change in favor of the Iranian people.
Do you think, would you like to see the United States or any other member of the international community actually play an active role in regime change?
Yes, simply because the values that we share are common. The Iranian people, who have nothing to do with this regime, have the same values, pursue the same goals, have the same aspirations, have the same dreams of every citizens that live in free countries. They want to have their freedom of religion. They want to be respected irrespective of their ethnicity, gender bias, or political orientation. Women want to be equal to men. People simply want to live. They want to have an opportunity to have jobs, to earn a living, to afford to get married, to live in security and peace within the country and with others, with our neighbors, with anybody else in the world. The only thing that stands in our way is this regime.
Mr. Pahlavi,
and all we are asking for the world to say is to support us in this quest.
For the Iranian people who, as you described them, are so fed up with this regime and the limitations it has put on the people, what do you think has prevented them from that civil disobedience, from stepping out into the streets like we saw in 2009?
Well, there were two things that happened to 2009. Number one was that the leadership of the movement was talking about remaining within the context of the existing constitution. Point number two is that the people on the streets were demanding the change, and at the time when the administration could have been in support, the leadership of the Green Movement rejected the need for any outside support, which pretty much lets the people hang high and dry. This time, I think people are saying, we are going to brave the street when the time comes, of course, provided that we have the assurance that we will have tacit support, and the leadership this time is not going to not ask for external support. And again, I'm saying support. I'm not saying intervention. I'm saying support in the sense of moral support, in terms of information, in terms of access, or any kind of reinforcing and empowerment of our civil society at home. The rest of us who are active inside and outside Iran, human rights advocates, political activists, know what they need to do. And of course, I in particular am working on a variety of scenarios that will lead us from the phase in which we are today, and also focusing on the transition to the next system, the kind of planning that needs to be done, the kind of organizations that have to be supported, so that we have the smoothest possible transition to a parliamentary secular democracy.
Reza Pahlavi, stay with us. I want to get closer into that particular vision for a future democratic Iran. Stay with us. We'll be right back, going out for a quick break. Go ahead. Back here on Debrief with Reza Pahlavi. He's the eldest son of Iran's late Shah, living in exile since the 1979 revolution and politically active from his home today in Washington. Mr. Pahlavi, we were beginning to speak about your vision for democratization in Iran in the future. I want to ask you first about the election we just saw. Hassan Rouhani was sort of described as an emerging voice of the opposition, at least relatively speaking. Were you encouraged by his victory?
First of all, let me analyze a little bit for you the dynamics of what has happened for years now in Iran. This kabuki dance, which is basically a charade when it comes to the meaning of elections, is nothing but some attempt by the regime to try to prove its legitimacy, basing it on the participation of the people. Now, we have three categories of people. Those who do not vote simply because they don't want to legitimize the regime. Then we have those who are forced to vote and coerced to vote. They have to have an actual stamp in their identity card, otherwise they won't be able to continue their studies or work for a governmental office and so on and so forth. And third, there are those who try to somehow send a message, like almost a referendum of some kind, by saying that this vote is not necessarily pro-Rouhani, but it's a vote against the establishment, against Khamenei. Because at the end of the day, the actors are one and the same. And I'm sure of all people, Israelis will understand this in particular. We have Ribbentrop and Himmler, but at the end they were both Nazis. And in that sense, whether it's Rouhani or the other guy, they end up serving a regime that is the most repressive regime that we have seen any time during history.
Mr. Pahlavi, so you say that all of the actors are the same. You yourself are still a very important figure for many Iranians, especially outside of Iran. We recently saw protests in Iran on Cyrus the Great Day, some people calling for you to return. Can you envision that happening in the near future, in any future?
I always stand to serve my country in whatever capacity that at the end my fellow compatriots will choose. But at this point, I only have one role, and my role is to lead this movement to the day when Iranians can finally say that we can conduct free and fair elections in Iran, that we can vote and decide and choose our representatives to form a constituent assembly, which will draft a new constitution, debate all its aspects, and ultimately, by means of national referendum, ratify the choice of the people, and the final form that this democratic secular system will take. And that day, the normalization process will occur, the new majlis will be elected, and the first governments will have to be elected as a result of political parties that would have in the process formed to elect the first next democratic government. I talk every day, Nurit, with my fellow compatriots. Most of them are young. Most of them are perhaps in their teens or their 20s. I can't tell you how much emotion they have in terms, regardless of the repression that they face. They want to maintain hope. A lot of them ask me to intervene and help them, and of course I told them the time will come, the circumstances have to be right. But they are also, through me, sending a message to the outside world that we don't want to be neglected, we don't want to be thrown under the bus, and they do hope that particularly democratic nations will heed their call and understand that we are your best allies against the same enemy. An enemy that has crushed us for nearly 40 years and has created so much havoc and instability in the region and beyond. Mr.
Pahlavi, you mentioned Israel briefly. I want to take you back in time. You are, of course, one of the people who will remember a very different reality when Iran had a much warmer relationship than we see today with Israel. Can you envision that changing in the future, those relationships?
Absolutely. Look, the best interests of democratic governments who are first and foremost caring about the betterment of life and the national interests of the country will have a foreign policy that is based on peace and cordial and brotherly relationship with our neighbors, Israel included, not to mention that we had a biblical relation since Cyrus the Great, as you mentioned. And let's understand one thing. It is a natural tendencies of democracies to unite. Look at Europe today with the European Union. It's a matter of natural attraction and strategic common interest. And it will be very difficult to argue against the fact that democratic nations will not work together towards more normalization, more liberalization, so long as we are able to eliminate the chief antagonists. And when the chief antagonists are eliminated, the whole region will breathe a sigh of relief, and we can finally focus on the real needs of our societies in every aspect. I must say that outside of politics, one of my greatest concerns is about the environmental crisis in Iran, water shortages, which is not limited to us but the whole region. And there's no way that we can address this when there has been so much mismanagement under such a corrupt system. Look, if there's no water in Iran, what are we going to build the country on? Within 10 years, maybe 10% of Iran's society will be forced to migrate because we won't have enough water in parts of our country.
Mr. Pahlavi,
imagine the various instabilities.
A very important statement to hear at this very important crossroads in time when we just heard President Trump sort of laying out a new world order in ways with new alliances that this administration seems to be planning for the future. Reza Pahlavi in Washington, thanks very much for weighing in with us right here on Debrief. And that's it for us for this time. We'll be back here tomorrow, same time, same place, from our studios right here in the Jazz Report. Have a great night.